Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good afternoon, everyone online. This is idagio.com. This is a talk from Verbier. You may recognize me from various other talks that I've had on Idagio over the last 16, 17 months, which is the Idagio live series. And this is an extension of that. I didn't realize we were doing that, but I can't be more happy. And if you remember, about a year ago, in June of 2020, my most distinguished guest of all time was, of course, Daniel Hope. And we're here together to talk about a wonderful project we're doing this Friday with our friends here at the Verbier Festival. Welcome, Daniel. Hello, Daniel.
Thank you.
I am not the host. I'm just giving you an introduction of why you are watching us here in Verbier. Yes, this is God's country, as you can see. This is an unbelievably beautiful place to be and to make music. Anyway, Daniel, great to see you.
Great to be here. Thank you very much indeed, Tom. And hello to everybody around the world. And of course to the people here in Verbier. It's wonderful to be back. And it's great to be here with you because we've spent a lot of time working together on various different projects. And I recall 2 years ago here in Verbier, we launched Berlin 1938, which was a project that I was very proud of, very moving and historical project. And this idea of putting music into historical perspectives is something that we both believe passionately in, you with song and the whole history of American music, which you devoted so much of your life to. But to be with you and to be brainstorming through these projects that we do is tremendous and gives me enormous energy.
Me as well, and along the lines for Verbier and the 1938 project, which, of course, you wrote, and we talked about music, and I got in that, but it was really your plan. But we immediately, even in the middle of rehearsal, said, "Oh, there's just another layer to this. There's another extension to this. There's another time." And even though 1938 sounds like we're wagging our finger, that's not what we're doing. What these projects are a celebration of cultural legacy. Quite frankly, they are remembering from where these great works of art came, under what circumstances. And I think that's what motivates Daniel and I so much. And quite frankly, Martin Engström, the director and founder of this festival, there's nothing he likes better than to take a piece of music and just explode it out into having people understand where it came from, who wrote it, why they wrote it, what was going on in their lives, what was going on in the world. I personally think this is going to become more and more themes of more and more presenters around the world. It's interesting. It is challenging for the artists. It gives everybody a far more consequential, if you may, on-ramp into the world of classical music. Because in the world of classical music, everything comes from something. It's not an accident. It's not an invention, a vehicle of, oh, well, let's see if this works, or this is a nice musical theme. Let's see if I can develop that into something that'll sell a bunch of sheet music. That's just not what happens in our world. And so the 38 project was deeply moving for all of us and deeply disturbing. And if I can just get that elephant out of the road, we spent a great deal of time in the 38 quoting the very famous dark figure of history, Mr. Goebbels. And unfortunately, Mr. Goebbels' drivel and manipulation of public mind and multimedia is very much still with us. And I think we should all be very aware of that. And what I mean by that is just the very notion of what everybody calls now fake news, or what the capital P propaganda world or word means. So I think there are 2 or 3 levels in these projects that we're trying to explore context in which great moments of art are either specifically indicative of the time they came from or have become, as they should, timeless. When I think of right immediately comes to mind the Gideon Klein trio, which is just a magnificent piece of music.
And maybe for some of the viewers watching who don't know what the project was, 2 years ago, we called it Berlin 1938, and the idea that we had was to tell the story of the year 1938 and to go month by month. And I had Tom as an American newscaster from
I enjoyed that very
1938.
much.
Together and paired against an extraordinary chansonnier and actor from Germany, Horst Maria Merz, who was the German counterpoint. And I took, with the script, basically the audience through the year, month by month, looking at the German news in each month and the American news. And we switched between the two of them as two radio presenters from that time, interspersed with music of the time. And it told the story of the beginnings of 1938, where things were still supposedly okay, where optimism was still in the air, and there was a sense of questioning as what would happen and would one get past where one was. And very quickly within that year, you realize it's not going to happen. And what I loved was your ability to switch between being the American newscaster, being an opera singer, being a chansonnier, and then the chemistry between you and Horst Maria Merz was extraordinary, because it was going against each other like ping pong balls, backward and forward. Plus, we had a phenomenal ensemble of musicians who were playing jazz, classical music, swing, everything like that. And so, inspired with that, and with your passion of American music and American history, we decided to do a follow-up production now for this Friday, which we're calling Los Angeles 1943, which seemed to be a perfect bridge to the other side of the coin, the flip side of the coin, the other spectrum. And I have to say, I've learned so much from Thomas about the repertoire, about the history there. You know, I knew a fair amount about, but not anything like what he does. And to see how he thinks and how he puts together pieces with political associations, with quotes. I think with these projects, the danger can be that you're putting in so many different types of music. You're blending in different genres, and that, for some people, I think is, can be confusing, because it's not a concert we're putting on here. It's not music theater. It's a different kind of a genre, and yet it's so current and so arresting.
And taking off from the 1938, exactly this point in this program, everything that we did in 1938 and everything we're going to do in 1943 is music that lived exactly in its time at the same time. So some random facts that you'll get if you come on Friday, and I presume you'll all be there. You should be. And if we're lucky, we'll get something for you to watch as well. But the beginning of 1940, and the framework of the 43 project, and also the subtitle is Exiles in Paradise, which is a bit of a quote on your magnificent book, Sounds of Hollywood, which I read cover to cover. Everyone should. It's wonderful. We all know about this enclave of immigrated, incredible talent that found itself in Hollywood, with fairly ambiguous relationships to Southern California through the various artists, but we'll get into that perhaps a bit later. But at the same time that Hollywood is kicking off, and you've got Duke Ellington having his Carnegie Hall debut in the winter of 1943, and you have the first time Billboard charts ever had a listing of pop songs. Of course, it was Frank Sinatra, and it was "I'll Never Smile Again." That was the #1 hit, and it was certainly on everybody's Sylvester concert on January 1, 1943. Coincidentally, January 1, 1943. General Leslie Groves was given the final green light and mandate to establish Project Y for the United States government to, in fact, investigate the possibilities of building an atomic bomb. And his first call was to Albert Einstein, who happens to be a very avid violinist. So you can imagine, we're going to twist you a little bit ins and outs. But the music of 1943 with Saint Sinatra, we've also got the movie Casablanca wins the Oscar for the best film. We have, what else we have? We have
Stormy Weather.
Stormy Weather. We have, I'm looking for one specific thing in 1943. The mind is a horrible thing to lose. There's another one, 1943. Yes, Oklahoma. Did I say that? No, that was it. Oklahoma debuts on Broadway, which was, of course, a sensation. So At the same time as 1943 and going into 1944 with these incredible pieces of music, of course, on the other side of the Atlantic, Hitler is about halfway through his 11 million murders. And everyone is trying to not know that did know, and those that didn't know didn't want to know. And this is the scandal. It's a scandal if we let it live. At the time, you have to accept what it was, and we'll go through the narration, the script. We're not here to point fingers. We're not here to accuse. We're here to awaken and to remember, and look at this phenomenon of consecutive events that we know in our minds separately, but we forget that they were actually exactly at the same time. And this is how the script's built. And I start sort of on the side as a dark shadow following us through the thing, but very lightly touched, I promise you, is this building of this phenomenal weapon that eventually was exploded on July 16, 5:29 in the morning, 1945. It was a test bomb called the Gadget. And so our framework is a little bit longer. It goes from 1943, which is at the heart of the war, America's denial of Europe. We got sucked into the war because of Pearl Harbor. I don't deal with any of that. We just start in 1943 with music. One of the things Americans are very good at is making fun of people. And believe it or not, the Oscar for Best Animated Film in 1943 was a Donald Duck cartoon called Der Führer's Face. And the incredibly talented, very funny musician, Spike Jones, was the soundtrack. And it's a lot of music that goes, Sieg Heil, higher, da, da, and it goes on. It's very funny. We're going to play that for you, for instance. So there's a lot of humor to begin with, and then things get slightly more serious. And of course, who else but Weil and Brecht to show up in Los Angeles and write a song called Und was bekam des Soldatens Weib? That's quite a powerful piece, and it's the different soldiers in the different cities that the Germans conquered, sending back known things of Oslo and Amsterdam and Belgium, and the last gift that is sent is from Russia, and it is a widow's schleier that is sent. So it's very, the coil starts to tighten there. A lot of, I don't want to tell the plot of the whole evening, but the idea that we're going to bounce back and forth a little bit more than we did in 38 to this denial and yet slow awakening to the horrors of what Central Europe was actually living through. And we try and tell that story with as little narration as possible and through the music. And that's been, as you mentioned before, that's been my passion in the projects of the last years. As you may well know, the Song of America project I've been with I created several, at this point, decades ago. The idea is to tell cultural history through the eyes of poets and the ears of composers, and let the music tell the story. And that's what I think we've really started. This is the beginning of what is going to be year-long projects, and we have quite a list of things, and we're of the same mind on so many things. And the most challenging part of either of these projects, I'm sure it was exactly the same in 38, is what you can't bring. You have to cut. We may even still cut some more this afternoon in terms of text. I don't want you all. The banks in Iglesia are not the softest, as I can tell you from an hour and a half of Schumann and Brahms last night, which was extraordinary. Never mind. So that's sort of another sort of 200-meter view of what we're doing.
And I think probably one of the greatest challenges also for us after we decided on the music is how do we get it played? Because we don't have a swing orchestra or a full symphony orchestra. We have basically 4 or 5 musicians. And to recreate a sound world that goes from Bing Crosby to Duke Ellington to Thelonious Monk and Arnold Schoenberg requires quite some planning. And it also requires a phenomenal arranger. And we're very lucky that a man in England called Paul Bateman, that I've been working with now extensively for the last couple of years, has arranged a number of these pieces. You have to find an arranger that's able to even do that, to take a huge complex score and put it so that it's coherent for 4 players. And he's really, what he's delivered is mind-blowing, and we're very grateful to him. Plus, we have some wonderful musicians and colleagues joining us. We have Lawrence Power on the viola, who many of you will know from extraordinary concerts here. We have Shekou Kane Mason. We have my friend Stéphane Logerot from Orchestre National de France on the bass. We have Mr. Thomas Hampson, in case you didn't realize. And we have Julien Quintin as well, marvelous pianist. So we have within those players, we have people that can adapt to different styles, and we can bring in the swing feel, the jazz feel, the classical feel. And I think that's also, makes the project special, because we're going to be drifting between the worlds.
It does make it special, and it's also, and I'm not here to advertise for Verbier, but there are not many places on the planet that embrace that kind of ecumenical and eclectic programming, and so my hat keeps going off to Verbier and certain to Martin and Avi Shoshani and Manuel Lopez and everybody running this place. It's fantastic to be given this kind of free rein, to have these kinds of conversations. Paul Bateman. I consider myself. If I call myself a musician, I don't know what to call him. I feel like he's a musician, and I'm really grateful to. I can read his notes.
Yeah. It's
so extraordinary what he's done for us. And it's a little different constellation of players this year than with the 38.
And it's a smaller ensemble as well, which
yeah.
in some ways is even more challenging, but no less talented. And I think the arrangements, we didn't use his arrangements 2 years ago. I had kind of stuff that was been prearranged. But I think he's written for the players themselves. That's also wonderful, that he has in mind how they're going to sound, and he's able to really take a huge symphonic Hollywood score and reduce it for 4 or 5 people, but
right.
that it really works. And we were rehearsing yesterday. We were all just knocked out by the quality of the arrangement.
At the end of the program, whatever ups and downs and ins and outs of the narrative, that I'm sure will have very surprising moments. I'll just make you slightly curious in that the influence and physical presence of Nazi-loving Americans was far more extensive than we remember in history, or that we're allowed to remember. And I'm not trying to awaken horrible memories, but we should just be very clear that Charles Lindbergh, running as a potential Republican candidate against FDR for the 40 election, was clearly a Nazi sympathizer. And Madison Square Gardens had crowds of 20,000 people listening to this drivel. I cannot resist making a glancing blow to contemporary times, and that's all I'll say. Far more disturbing was the infiltration, if that's the word, of Nazi ideology at the children's level. And there were camps in America trying to indoctrinate, unfortunately at a very small level, but they were there. And I'm going to leave all that to be a surprise for you on Friday. You will be surprised how prevalent, how indoctrinated it was. We were surprised. You heard about it. You told me. I drilled down, sent to you. Then we both went, oh my God. And I want to actually give another one of our colleagues, the great journalist from the New York Times, Alex Ross. He wrote a phenomenal article about this place in Los Angeles, as well as a recent article on the emigres. So if you look up Alex Ross on the New York Times, you'll find some really marvelous author, a wonderful, intelligent person. So those are the kinds of ins and outs and ups and downs we're going to go as we also celebrate black music in America, the creativity of black America, in the time of deep Jim Crow legislation, meaning segregation and abuse to the African American community, racial abuse to the African American community, that we are, even as we speak, in a very tense, again, confrontational time, hopefully recognitional time, hopefully finally embrace the obscenity of racism in our country, in America, so that we can collectively move forward truly as a diverse, democratic nation. I'll not say any more. But the music will be there. You'll be also pleasantly surprised to that. And then, of course, we get to some of the more tragic stories, like Gideon Klein, like these composers who were in Theresienstadt, who were editing their last music in December of 1944, knowing full well they would not live to see Easter. Gideon Klein's story is slightly more tragic, and I only tell it because it doesn't come up in the evening, but it's just rather breathtaking what really happened. Gideon Klein actually heard the words liberation. He knew the Americans were coming. The Allied forces, I should say, were coming to liberate the camps. And probably as they were seen cresting the hill, the German soldiers were under orders to line up the intelligentsia of the camps and be sure they were dead before the liberating soldiers came. Gideon Klein did not die in a gas chamber. He died of a bullet in the head. We talk so much about the Holocaust. The other thing that just deeply moves me, we cannot forget that 11 million people were killed. I just can't get over that.
It's staggering, and it's and to pick up on Gideon Klein, I mean, he was in his 20s, and this was a man who, when he arrived in Theresienstadt, became really one of the motors for encouraging people not to give up. And there were some very famous composers in Theresienstadt: Hans Krase, Victor Ullmann, Pavel Haas. And Hans Krase, for example, had literally given up any hope of continuing. And it was Gideon Klein that said to him, "You have to keep going. You have to. You have to perform. You have to write. You have to produce music." And he organized concerts. He put on exhibitions. He threw himself into the cultural life that had been allowed. And there is something I find in his music that has this incredible energy. And the reason that I discovered the music of Theresienstadt was because of Gideon Klein, and not knowing who he was. I was driving one night after a concert, and I heard a string trio on the radio. And I remember just thinking, what is that music? And it was a string trio I was trying to guess. It had elements of Bartok, Janacek, Stravinsky. But I was so taken with it that I had to actually pull over to hear the announcer tell me who it was. I didn't want the signal to die so that I would not know what this music was. And then the announcer said this was a piece by Gideon Klein. And I had absolutely no idea who that was. And when I got back to the hotel, I started to Google. And this whole wealth of information came back at me about Klein, Theresienstadt. And that was what triggered it. And I often come back to that story because if you know the story of Klein and you know the tragedy and you know what these people went through, it becomes, even more emotional. But I didn't know that when I heard the piece. I just heard something that was so strong and so powerful. And when you look at the music that was written in Theresienstadt by these incredibly brave people, the one thing that I notice is that there's nowhere to turn a page. There are no pauses. Because why would you write a pause when your time is that limited? And so often when we played these pieces before we had iPads, we would put out 5 music stands and have 10 pages together because it's constant expression. And it was the feeling that every single note counted. And that is something that, at least in hindsight, I believe I felt something of it, but not really knowing about it. So Gideon Klein will play a role in our evening, even though this evening is based around Los Angeles. But Los Angeles and Europe and America is as one as far as that period of time is concerned. And I think we both thought it was very important to look at, whether it's through American eyes or ears, but to come back to Europe as well.
Well, all of the immigrants that were very famous in Los Angeles, and some of them very glad, obviously all of them to be glad to be alive. Some of them found themselves more comfortable there than others, and we have some of the more humorous quotes of that as well. But all of the immigrants in Los Angeles were deeply aware of their relatives and friends that were not in Los Angeles, and their colleagues. and deeply preoccupied with that. And they were writing letters to the government. They were pleading with FDR. FDR, probably by the time we got in, I mean, this is a little bit earlier than 43, but the reluctance of America to get into the war, which was essentially then taken out with Pearl Harbor, but also Lusitania. But there was the Americans, you know, it's easy to look west when you're already 3,000 miles from east. And I think that's what came up. But and the actually immigration laws were actually far stricter than they should have been at the time. And it was far more difficult to get in already 40 and 41 to the United States. So these immigrants, the immigrés as we call them, this exiles in paradise, is such an amazing combination of spectacular talent, and yet incredibly deeply rooted Europeans who knew exactly what was going on, and were deeply and trying to tell people this. And they're also carrying on, and you know, a lot of them bitching and screaming in the Hollywood sweat factories of music, and writing music for 3 minutes and 2.5 minutes, and no, I need a door slamming at this point, all this film music, but in fact creating unbelievable masterpieces, which you'll hear glimpses of in both the medleys, but especially in the second medley, Roja and so forth. I remember doing now it must be 20 years ago, I did a project in Salzburg called Verboten und Verbannt, and the idea was forbidden and banned. The idea was not just about Nazis, it was about chauvinism in general. It was about the denial of artistic effort. Of course, the program started with Mendelssohn and ended then with Schweitzer and Eisler. And I remember that, because you're talking about Kraja and Ullmann and Klein, they wrote songs. And they're really very extraordinary songs. And so the musical output, the story of Gideon telling people that the only thing we have that we can give evidence of ourselves and pass on is what we do as artists. And it reminds me now of a project that's in Vienna and going full bore called Exilarte. And Exilarte is literally a repository run by the wonderful University of Vienna, where relatives of any composer of any time, but especially the 20th century, and especially of the dark time, if they have any of the manuscripts or they have any of the evidence of this, that they can give it to the university, and it will be protected. And there has just been an avalanche of material come in. Well, I never knew what to do with this. My great uncle, he didn't live through this, but he wrote this and so forth. And the guy is sorting this out. It's an unbelievable archive, and that's what I said at the beginning. This is about the hearing this wonderful archive of cultural legacy. At the end of the day, to me, the arts are the evidence of our lives here. It's not something we create to try and tell something else. It is we create as an evidence of our experiences. And so these kinds of programs that we build, as tough as they can be, I think are terribly reinforcing that it's okay to remember. It's okay to be angry. And it is every generation's responsibility to be profoundly respectful of people's lives in the past. We can throw out the obscenities of culture and rules and regulations and legislation, but we must give people, our colleagues, our ancestors, a break.
I also think it's really wonderful that artists nowadays, we're two of many, but that we can do these kind of projects. That I think, the world of music and the world of classical music and the way in which music is presented has changed enormously. And Verbier, of course, is at the forefront of that, of showing what is possible and how you can create or curate programs. But I'm not sure that 20 years ago one could have put together an evening quite like this. It would have been different for sure. But nowadays, with the way that things are, with communication, the way that things are, just the fact we have a global audience listening to this now with the event of streaming, plus the research that has now become so kind of homed in, we can find so many facts of where this music comes from. We can access it, we can share it, we can disseminate it, and that, I think, gives these projects also a whole different amount of weight, I think, actually, as to be just, let's say, a nice festival idea. And in festivals, it's a joy to come together with friends, and you work too hard, you have too little sleep, and we just give everything we possibly can, and we're exhausted but elated at the same time. And that festival atmosphere that we all know and love is particularly the case here in Verbier. But to then take all of that and the feelings and the emotions of a festival, of a summer festival, and to start to dig deep into the bowels of history, and to investigate questions that have a topicality and they have a current strength about them. For me, makes me proud to be a musician, actually, and proud to be an artist, because I'm able to investigate things that interest me and that I don't know enough about. And there's so much I don't know enough about, but I'm learning. And we learn from the great masters of classical music every day when we look at their scores. But to illuminate their lives and to illuminate those of their contemporaries and discover new people. William Grant Still, for example, who I'd heard about, but Thomas was the one that said, you have to play his music. Tell us a little bit about him. I mean...
Well, implied in what you just said is actually a huge thank you to you, the audience in Verbier, because Martin couldn't trust his instincts if he didn't have the support of a public that keeps coming. And we're talking to you, a rather humble group here this afternoon on the terrace of a beautiful hotel, but also to you online. And that's been the fun thing about going to the next level in the digital world with Idagio over the last 18 months, is that we have more doors and more windows that we can open, that more people can find their own way through what sometimes is rather intimidating, called the classical world. What we're saying to you today is that it also allows us so much more freedom and depth to what we want to do in recreating these magnificent pieces of art in their context as well. So if maybe this is a time we all get to smile and say, well, I guess this is one of the silver linings to the dark clouds of the COVID pandemic, which I also unfortunately don't think we're through with, parenthetically. To William Grant Still, specifically, I just did a wonderful program called A Celebration of Black Music under the umbrella of my project called Song of America. And I found myself often explaining, and it was in Hamburg, and it was specifically oriented to European minds and audiences. The Europeans were the first to embrace Walt Whitman. The Europeans were the first to embrace Langston Hughes, the iconic African-American poet of the early 20th century. And as there was a great sympathy pouring out through contemporary Europe last year for the Black Lives Matter movement, in my opinion, rightfully so, I called my dear friend Christoph Lieben and I said, do people know what this diversity sounds like? And we realized that just a lot of black music, as we call it, or African-American composers in the classical African-American classical music canon, is not only not very well known in America, but certainly not known in Europe. And so my passion has been the sound of diversity. I think that it is high time that if you can't have a sentence of legitimacy about democracy if it does not have the word diversity in it. And diversity is, to me, the great challenge that we face today, because we are still in a world of legislated non-diversity, especially in America. Where this applies to somebody like William Grant Still is that, and I was going to say, I often found myself talking about this parallel universe of creativity by African-American composers and poets and writers, especially through the 20th century, but deeply in the 19th century as well, that lived... I mean, if you get to know this repertoire and you start connecting the dots of these various lives, you realize that they are absolutely contemporary to the names that you know. Huge names like Aaron Copland, or less known names like William Schumann or John Alden Carpenter. But the African Americans, you know, this extraordinary woman, Florence Price, who was the first woman, much less African American woman, to have a symphony played by an American orchestra. right? William Grant Still had exactly the same thing. Where did their music go? Why didn't that take root? Why didn't that happen? Why do you have to study or be surprised about finding out about composers of the African American heritage? And it's not just African American heritage. This isn't just African music. This isn't just black music. This is American cultural. This is the tapestry of who we are as Americans. And this music is incredible. And William Grant Still wrote 9 operas and, I don't know, 6 symphonies. I don't know how many chamber pieces, probably 85, 90 songs. I may have all the, I know that the 9 operas is right, but maybe I haven't got the statistic. But you get the idea of the depth and the breadth of it. Of course, some of it was played, but it would have its performance, and that was that. We played in Hamburg William Dawson's Negro Folk Symphony from 1934. It was a huge success, standing ovations, people were crazy. It had 5 more performances and wasn't heard of again for how long? Now, you can connect your own dots of what that's all about in America, but this is the kind of cultural heritage in America that I'm very passionate about, and one of my big passions is William Grant Still. For instance, you probably have heard of, or may even heard, the Copeland Lincoln Portrait, based on the life of Abraham Lincoln. It's a wonderful piece of music, and it's a wonderful text, and it's very American and very democratically ordered and so forth. A year before that piece was written, William Grant Still wrote Plain Chant for America in 1942, an equally powerful piece that I had the pleasure of programming and singing in an American project I did in Vienna several years ago, and Just was coaching, and it gets done once in a while, but it's a wonderful piece, absolutely the same level and same content. In 1944, William Grant Still wrote specifically a eulogy to the black soldiers fighting for democracy that died, that were not eulogized in America. There was a huge black regiment that was honored with the Légion d'honneur of France because of their unbelievable fighting and saving of the French Republic. They came home and were threatened with lynching if they marched to the seats of Harlem. This is the world of the 40s, and it keeps on going. I just want to touch on some of those things. But in all of that time, you still have Charlie Parker. You still have Langston Hughes. You still have William Grant Still, Margaret Bonds, Florence Price, County Cullen. You have Margaret Bonds and Florence Price, and William Dawson. And in the popular idiom, who else am I thinking of? Who wrote Round Midnight? Is that Charlie Parker? No, Thelonious Monk. Thelonious Monk. You know, huge. I mean, America is unthinkable in the 20th century without black culture. Absolutely unthinkable. And yet, under what derisive circumstances were they composing and the drivel that substantiated the lower level of life was the same bullshit that was spewing out of the face of Goebbels and his minions. And if there is a message in what I do and now this, it would be that. This shit isn't going away. And it only goes away if good people say no. Bad, that's the power of tyranny, when good people refuse to stand up and say no. And that is our responsibility today. And I do believe that the arts and the humanities can inform people so that each individual can make that decision for themselves. I am not trying to tell anyone what to do. I'm just saying we must, when it's obvious and wrong, be ready to stand up and say no more. And William Grant Still was a really cool guy. But I mean, I'll tell this story. I've done his songs before. I remember this like a story. So William Grant Still, let's pretend that I'm living in his time in Los Angeles, and William Grant Still's writing some songs. He said, "Oh, get me that Tom Hampson to sing those songs." And I said, well, "I'd be honored." And so I go over to William Grant Still's house, and we work on the songs, and he even dedicates them. It's fantastic, and everybody's going, "Oh my God, this is a great series," and so forth. And so what do? Well, the day of the performance is going to be down at the Dorothy Chandler in Los Angeles, and I'm over at Mr. Grant's house. He says, "Why don't we just take the bus down and we'll go to the rehearsal together?" "Oh, thank you, Mr. I'm honored. Great, let's go." And we get in the bus, and he goes to the back, and I go to the front. That's sick. That kind of gets the point across, right? That's the life. And the back on the front of the bus is still with us, folks, in every country.
And
I'm done preaching, by the way.
No. But firstly, if it were even the same bus, it might have even been a separate one. And I'm thinking about, where I come from, where I was born, which is South Africa. And my father is sitting here in the audience as a very renowned and famous author and somebody that fought tooth and nail against the apartheid regime. And in fact, in the early 70s, you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, Dad, but created a student magazine by the name of Bolt, in which he published the poem of Leopold Senghor, who was the president of Senegal at the time. And that was literally a red flag to the apartheid regime, because from that second on, he was on the wanted list, and the phones were tapped and they were followed. And he went on in that he supported black writers and black poets. And when they came to visit him, they weren't allowed to use the same elevator in order to go up and have dinner. And yet he kept doing that. And that was back in the early 70s. And, he has, ever since then, has believed very much in equality. It's something that he's installed in us. And, I even though this is a different theme, it's not actually. That's the point. I think that's what you made so succinctly. It seems to be different ages and different times, but actually it's not. It's all incredibly interconnected.
It's a soundtrack.
It is. But here we are.
Reminds me of a Herodotus.
Here we are in 2021 in this spectacular backdrop, coming out of a pandemic, which has been, in every sense, horrifying and terrible. And but we're still here, and that I find is something is very special and very important. We're still able to use music and use the arts and to savor them in projects like this. But even just listening to this glorious concert today with the Brahms and the Brahms Piano Quintet, and just being there without a word being said, everything was said in one phrase, and you're reminded constantly of the beauty of life, which is so close to death and destruction and reality, and yet music has something, I think, unlike any other art form. At least that's my personal feeling, that it gives an elevation regardless of whether you speak the language or whether you're inducted into it or not. It reaches you directly, and there's no escape from music. There's no way to escape its beauty, its passion, its the intrinsic value of what music can do. And we know also what music can generate. I mean, I've seen it with people with autism. I've seen it with kids who are severely handicapped, who have lost touch, seemingly, with the world out there. I've seen doctors say this person is non-responsive. The only way we can keep this person alive is with medication. She does not respond, let's say, and then you play a piece of music, and you see a response. You see the response in those people's eyes. People who have not responded for years.
It's you remember that wonderful film called Awakening with Robin
Yes.
Williams and De Niro? That was fantastic.
Yes.
But it is interesting because this is really the front line of brain research, is really where these various synapses and syntax are happening in the brain, and ergo the entire nervous system. And it is really quite interesting. And there's been some wonderful, your Music on Brain and Jeremy Sachs books. And there's a whole bunch of new books coming out which are really illuminating to the idea that music is a bit of an echo of our own vibrations. And that's why it can mean so much to us. You don't have to know why Brahms wrote that, but very often when you hear something and it really touches you, and we say the word touch, but if actually it's just literally vibrating. Your molecules are lining up in a kind of sympathy to Mr. Brahms, which then asks, gee, why did Brahms write that? And so, You know, it's incredibly the exchange of musical energy between living human beings, we who recreate, those who create for us, and you. It's not a passive engagement in a concert. You must be open to take on this vibration and share that. It is a sharing moment between podium and audience, and very often I think that I really loathe the word performance, because this idea of this presentational, and I know Daniel feels the same way. What we really are doing is recreating a world in which we can all participate. For me, the energy of any opera house or any concert house is from the audience to the stage. We are the doorways to something far more interesting than our own persons, and far more important than all of us put together. I mean, that's the genius of great art. And again, back to Verbier. Yes, we are a more humble audience in numbers, but all of the festivals that have just plowed through this summer and said, no, we are going to be here. We are going to have music. Who can come, and yes, wear your masks and do all this other thing and test as often as you need to be. I've been tested more often for, never mind, whatever, test me away. But that we're here, and you feel the same way I do. As a musician, whether it's 3 people, 30 people, 300 people, or 3,000 people, it's music.
Absolutely. And I mean, that was one of the main things about the pandemic. We both did a lot online during that time because it was a wonderful outlet.
Don't be so
for
modest.
us.
Your Hope at Home, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Your Hope at Home series was a balm to the society. I mean, you can't imagine how many of our friends and colleagues and people I just know casual. Oh, did you see? Do you know who Daniel Hope is? Oh, he has his Hope at Home. You can be as modest as you want, but what you did saved lives.
Well, I appreciate that. But I love doing it, and it was a wonderful outlet to invite almost 400 artists to come along and give them a chance to do something, to make music, to share it. And I wouldn't give it up for anything. I loved it. But this first second, I'm sure you were the same, when I got back on stage, the first concert, when you had a real audience, when you had that interaction, it was amazing. It was breathtaking. And, the camera is there, we can see it. And what I learned about the Hope at Home thing was that there really is an audience behind that camera. It wasn't just a passive thing. You were speaking to an audience. And because of the online thing, you would, have thousands of comments on every concert, which would go on for weeks and months. People would relive it. And yet, that second when the person sighs, or the person laughs, or the person is moved, or you are moved, or this feeling that you're not alone actually up there, that was really, was terribly moving for me and important, I think, just to realize where we are again and that we can somehow get through this, which, I think we're all desperately hoping that we can.
We will. We did. And we'll get through more of it. I'm tempted to open up to any questions you might have. I mean, I don't know if we have a floating microphone, or I can give you this one. We might lose you a little bit if we're in our audience here. We can, of course, repeat the question. Does anybody have anything they'd like to offer this afternoon? A testimonial or a question? Anything you would come up with, ma'am?
And I love what you said, saying that you are there to open a door. And it seems obvious, but I had not really thought about it like this before. And it's so much more interesting now to see it that way. Thank you very much for saying
Well, you're
that.
very welcome. And I'm stealing it from actually any number of classes with my young colleagues, because when somebody asks me about being nervous on stage, which we all are, I mean, there's a heightened nervousness, but when you start talking to young colleagues, they say, well, I come out on stage and I've got this to remember, and yada, yada, yada. I say, well, what if I told you you don't have to convince anybody of anything? What if I told you that that's not what you're there for? You're there to make the music. It is for you to make something higher, let them make up their own minds. You know, so I was just kind of paraphrasing on that, but I appreciate you offering that reflection. I think it's good for the audience as well. We are not there to measure one another, and we are in an incredibly important social event with each other, usually shoulder to shoulder, but nevertheless, whatever the restrictions are, we are a community in a concert hall. And Busoni wrote so passionately about this, that the music event was more like a temple of itself, but that this social dimension of people with one another, breathing the same air, experiencing the same musical vibrations, that this is 100 years ago he's writing this was so elemental to the needs of the human psyche. However, the point we sometimes forget is that the actual experience is deeply, intensely individual. And so you get the seasoned concert going at the Winterreise, saying, sitting next to the neophyte and saying, oh, well, I'm so glad you enjoyed that, but I'm sure he only got 10% of what it's really about. And that might be true, but for that person, that's their 100%. And me as an artist, and I know Danny felt the same way, that's why we do what we do. That's the whole point of it. Any other questions? So many questions? Please.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I want to congratulate you. You're fantastic, both of you. I mean, I agree with every word you say. Cannot agree more. And I was wondering, in your projects, in your future projects, which I think will go on, is there any room to do something about the Women's Orchestra of Auschwitz, which is also just a big subject, you know?
But also there's this orchestra in Vienna who's dedicated
to this, to Alma Rosé, and this whole story? Exactly. Because I would love to see you both doing something about that.
That's an interesting point. It was in case you didn't hear it, the question was whether there was a scope for us in one of our future projects to do something about the women's orchestra in Auschwitz, which is an unbelievably moving story around Alma Rosé, who was the daughter of the famous concertmasters of the Vienna Philharmonic. And I mean, I've read a lot about that story. I've met some of the survivors who actually performed in that orchestra. It was part of the research that I did over about 25 years, trying to still meet people who could speak from the first generation. And there have been elements, in fact, of those stories that have found their ways into projects that I've done already. One with Anna-Sophie von Otter, for example, which had some of the quotations of Alma Rosé. And so, I think the more we can find out about these extraordinarily brave people, the better it is. And I had heard about this orchestra you talked about in Vienna that has, I think, dedicated as their mission is to tell that story. I think there's a film even about it.
There is a film. And also the woman who's more or less responsible for it is the daughter of Erwin Ratz, who was the first critical edition editor of the Gustav Mahler Musicological Society. And he and Bruno Walter and the Vienna Philharmonics have founded the Gustav Mahler Society that is still alive and well 60 years later, and I was on the board for 14 years. But it's just, there's all sorts of these connectivities. But I'll go you one farther, and that is the entire proposition of women's creativity. And this has been a passion of the Hampson Foundation, the foundation I have for education and song, and have become friends with some really wonderful scholars who have just... You can't imagine how rich women's creativity even in the 19th century was. I mean, the two easiest ones are Fanny Hensel and Schumann, exactly. But there's so many more. There's contemporaries of Beethoven as well, and of course it goes into the 20th century, and you even get to then even in their story and this enormous creativity that has been largely patronizingly performed or blatantly ignored over the years, you get to something as specifically horrifying as this orchestra in Theresienstadt. I know that our colleague Annie-Sophie von Otter did a wonderful, and there's a DVD in fact, and she did a wonderful project on the music of the Theresienstadt and the scholars and so forth. So this would be the kind of program that could come to Verbier You know, we have to live a long time to do all of our programs, but I'm up for that. Anyone else have something they'd like to offer? You don't actually have to agree with us. You can even say and stand up and say you're full of nonsense, and we can agree to disagree.
Well, we do certainly have to go and rehearse for this
It's about
project.
that time, isn't it?
So if anybody, of course, here would like to come to this performance, the word you don't like very much, but the concert, historical concert, let's call it, it's going to be this Friday. That's the 30th.
8 o'clock.
8
no?
o'clock in the church here in Verbier. And we're looking forward immensely to doing it. We're very excited. And
Bring a pillow to sit on. It might go on. It might go exactly. It might go on a while. But and all of you online, thank you for joining us in this wonderful atmosphere. And you can't come on Friday, but we have every hope someday to film these projects and make them more available. And we'll certainly be talking about them more and find a way to have you included even more. And thank Adagio for making these talks possible, and the Verbier Festival for allowing us so much latitude and all of this incredibly healthy analog digital friendship and association. Thank you very much, everybody.
thank you. Bye-bye.